It's always a small world. You always know someone, or find someone who knows
That
someone.
class through the high school never had that. There's so many of them were dogs.
Alright.
Well, my dad was the only
But
son,
they're always there to help.
and he almost was killed in Okinawa.
Yeah.
But he did 3 island campings. So. Yeah, you know, we never talked about it. Either.
Yeah, on a used case tractor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad, and I had to mention in my introduction, I'm a new behavioral health specialist for Colorado Agribility Project. I grew up in central Nebraska. Both my parents were raised on farms and then pursued their own occupations from there, but had the ability to spend a lot of time growing up and spending time on the farms. And I'm really grateful for the values that those agricultural values, the connection to seasons, the connection to the land, to nature, that I recognize really helped to form a lot of my character, a lot of my personality. Went into a career in mental health. And so for the last 20 years, I've been a therapist working in a number of different settings, primarily with adolescents as my target population. But to work well with adolescents, you have to work with the systems around them. And so a lot of time with parents, a lot of times with community members and stakeholders and people invested in the lives of those youth. And so I worked in rural northern New Mexico for quite a few years, worked in Weld County, did a lot of in-home work where I was meeting with families at their kitchen tables, helping them figure out how to best support their child. And then the last 7 years, I was working in youth corrections. And so joke around that working there during the pandemic was enough to pay off all the karmic debt from my teenage years. And it's about time for me to shift gears. So it's been really nice to come into this setting. One of the things that I was asked to really focus on was suicide prevention, understanding trauma. And these are all things that have been really near and dear to a lot of my practices. So I'm going to work them in here. What I was tasked with sharing with you all for the course of this workshop for this year, and this was determined as part of the grant. It was written to fund all of our activities and work. And one of the things we wanted to kind of target was really promoting emotional well-being, behavioral health as it relates to us as we age. And so that's kind of where the topic came from. So go ahead and jump into it here. Wonder if that was the lifespan of the battery. Well, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Yes.
Like that?
Can you put it back to the, I'll do it for you here.
Well, it's not moving there either. So
No, I think something's blocked up.
There we go.
Wouldn't be.
I just wanted to just do that for you.
I think this thing might be working.
Maybe disconnected. Yep,
okay.
Yeah.
yep. Technology. Have you guys seen this little owl thing we have here?
Pretty fancy it was.
It's an owl.
That's why we're here.
Little camera.
It's like a camera, so when you speak, it'll go to you
Oh,
and project you and then listen to you. So it's pretty neat. So the spy is in the room.
And even if you're not
My
speaking, it seems to zoom to certain places. So
Yeah.
give a hand to these ladies on our front table here because I think you got a bunch of FaceTime. All right, so my title was Promoting Emotional Wellbeing in the Golden Years. Anyone know where the term the golden years comes from? Yes, sir.
All the gold it takes to stay alive when you get.
Well, you know, that was closer to my theory too. I had this like image of it coming from like ancient Greece or like a golden age or something. And yes, the cost of living is certainly one of them. But come to find out that it's actually a relatively new term. course, I'm covering the actual year there, so I may be misquoted, because I don't have it memorized. Let me find it out.
1959.
Is that, yeah,
It says.
oh, perfect, thank you. All right, you'll be my fact checker if anything else is covered. But so, yeah, in 1959, it was part of an advertising campaign for a chunky desert out in Arizona that wanted to create a 55 and better community. So that's where the term came from. I'm going to go through some statistics through the course of this. And one of the things I want to point out about statistics is there's this thing called the bell curve. And so that's this section here. Bell curve can apply to almost any phenomenon we want to study, from herd or crop health to human behavior. So for example, it could be IQ. Vast majority of us are going to fall in here in terms of IQ. There's geniuses, there's some developmental disabilities, but the vast majority of us are here. We could apply the same thing to, if we were to poll all of us and say, generally, what do we think about the virtue of cats as a household pet? Some people would say, I will build on an addition to my house to have more cats. Other people say, I do not want them on my property at all. And then some of us are here in the give and take area. So the reason I point this out is because what I want to talk about through the course of this is some basic research around promoting good emotional well-being and brain health as we age. And I like to stress this because the whole thing with going through research is we all have this ones, these are called outliers. People in the fall into these groups are called outliers. So when we're talking about generally how to be healthy, happy, and have good quality of life as we age, we're all going to know that one person that drank a fifth of whiskey and smoked cigars all day long and lived to be 107 and was still like dancing ballet or whatever else they were doing. And we know the person that's been healthy all their life, been in marathons, and unfortunately passed away at 42 on a treadmill. So there are some things we can't influence, but there's a lot that we can. So one of the things to be aware of with aging is that this is a relatively new field of research. And the understanding and the research developments are really happening on an almost daily basis. So it's kind of exciting. This is the life expectancy at birth for the United States. So if you look at back in 1900, it was right around the late 40s. And so then we jump all the way, some of these are projections, but here we are at 2022. And then we're looking at mid 70s for males, early 80s for females. That's a substantial growth, substantial improvement in lifespan. And so if we look at this from a global perspective, it's even more pronounced. So back in 1900, worldwide, the life expectancy was less than 35 years of age. That's profound. You jump all the way up to where we are now, and it's mid 70s across the entire globe. So what that means is we are just beginning to understand the actual limitations and potential that goes into aging. Things that we thought we were like destined to have to endure or go through maybe 50 years ago as it relates to aging, we're now finding that we basically get to write the scripts as we go, and we're learning more and more all the time about what actually we can do to better ourselves and what the potential is for continued growth. So what this means though too is that we're really going to have to come to terms with the impact of aging as a society and how much we're going to have to develop to support this very soon here actually. So actually, let me call my fact checker. Can you read that top
52 million.
All right. Older population grew from 3 million in 1900 to 52 million in 2018. Older population in 2030 is projected to be more than twice as large as in 2000, growing from 35 million to 73 million and representing 21% of the total US population. The one of the plugs put in here is North American anti-aging market was worth $17.4 billion in 2021 and expected to grow to $22.47 billion by 2026. So if you have any homemade anti-aging, anti-wrinkle creams, anything like that, and you want to get on the market, now's the time to do it. That may help offset the gold, how much the cost of gold requires to keep us going. So But the important thing about this is we really have to come to terms with what is this going to mean in terms of the health benefits, the health demands that are put on our population, and the social supports. I mean, if we look at, I think there's a statistics, I'm sorry I don't have it mentioned here, but basically 80% of all care for people as they age comes from other family members. And so that's great if you have those built-in supports and that kind of network. But what we're going to be facing as a nation here very soon is to really be taxed on how do we make sure that everyone gets the care that they need. As such, it's also in our interest to look at, regardless of what age we are, what can we do to best ensure our own well-being and take care of ourselves too. The other thing I'll point out through the course of this is feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, just ask a question if anything comes up for you. We don't have to wait till the end to do that. So it talks about the anti-aging industry. And I think as a culture, those of us in North America have this sort of bipolar relationship with aging. On one hand, we recognize the importance of it. We do our best to be able to honor our family members, ourselves as we start to move up in years. But there's also this really strong denial and ability to kind of push away from the reality of that. And so by contrast, there's some Eastern cultures that have a daily practice of going through these 5 remembrances. So first one is, I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. Number 2, I am of the nature to have ill health. There's no way to escape ill health. I am of the nature to die. There's no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. And then lastly, my actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. Now, at face value, this sounds kind of dark. Like if you have to say this every morning, like, geez, I don't really want to get up and go out of bed. But the reality is, if you understand it, you really come to accepting of it. What it means is be grateful for every moment. Be grateful for every interaction you have with those you care about. Be grateful for those moments that we can wake up, or those mornings we can wake up and your back's not killing you. And you do have the ability to ambulate, to move around. And then lastly, the thing about the actions is that that's really what I'm left with. So I have choices every day. Am I moving myself closer to the person that I want to become? Am I moving myself closer to those that I care about? Or am I not? But at the end of the day, it's my choices. That's the only thing I get to control. Life's going to throw me all sorts of curveballs, and how I navigate my own reaction to it, the choices I make, at the end of the day, that's the foundation that I hold on to. I'm stressing that now because as we go forward, hopefully, what we share through the course of this rest of this presentation will either one, affirm things that you are already doing to take care of yourself. So if some of these resonate and you're like, hey, yeah, that's important to me, I've been doing that. Good, give yourself a pat on the back. If it motivates you to start picking up a few other practices, that's important too. And I'll also say that none of this is meant to be like, by registering for this, you didn't sign up to have to do all these things I'm going to propose. So you can take and choose from them what you will. So one of the things I like to have you consider is, for those of you that are involved in production agriculture, what might be the most valuable piece of equipment for your operation? I guess we're kind of looking at you guys today. What's your most valuable piece of equipment?
The person that's doing the work.
Good, thank you. If I had candy to hand out, you're welcome to help yourself. Snacks there, you get the bonus for answering that. So yes, that is absolutely the most important thing. And if you look at, there's a lot of pretty high dollar, big investment pieces of equipment that are required to be a successful operator. And so you wouldn't slack on the maintenance for any of those. And so we really want to push to not slack on the maintenance for yourself and within you, your mental engine. So we're going to talk a little bit about brain science, starting with neuroplasticity. That's just a really fancy word that means that our brains constantly change and evolve in response to our environment. And this was really important for me working with adolescents, because the entire point was to teach them a new set of behavior, a new way of looking at the world, and a new skill set. And so I was really interested in neuroplasticity from that perspective about the beginning portion of life. And so I was curious about, is there any relevance to that now that I'm tasked with putting together this presentation for aging? And yeah, there is a ton. And the most important part of that is that neuroplasticity continues until the day we die. No matter what age we are, as long as our environment pushes us and challenges us a little bit and we get some positive reinforcement for it, our brains will continue to evolve and change. And that is a huge thing to be aware of in terms of promoting good mental well-being, regardless of how old we are. So that being said, it is, again, one of those remembrances, one of the things we have to accept is that we are the nature to grow old. We will all eventually pass. And so there is a decline here that we can't really escape. And so this whole thing right about kind of peaks about 46. So about 2 years ago for me, starts to go down a little bit like this. And this has to do with all areas of basically cognitive functioning and processing and whatnot. But there's some flexibility in it. Let me, actually, we'll come to that in another slide. So one of the things to be aware of is that there's some pretty big gap between this, which is numeric ability, and up here, which is verbal ability. So one of the things to be aware of is that over the years, life experiences, the ability to communicate, what we learn in our basic exchanges from others, that stays really sharp. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's superior to someone in their early and mid 20s. But things like numeric ability, which I guess I'm already probably about down there anyway, but numeric ability, some of those processing things related to being able to quickly synthesize abstract information, that stuff does decline over time. And so there's a sort of natural sort of curve and downward trend with this. And then again, there's some outliers if we think about that bell curve we were talking about before. And I won't go a whole lot into this because it's beyond my scope, but I do want to talk about just, quick footnote on the difference between expected cognitive decline, which we have to accept as part of that aging process, and cognitive impairments such as dementia. So dementia is not a specific disease, it's a descriptive term for a collection of disorders that can be caused by a collection of symptoms that can be caused by a number of disorders that affect the brain. People with dementia have significantly impaired intellectual functioning that interferes with normal activities and relationships, lose their ability to solve problems, maintain emotional control, and may experience personality changes and behavioral problems. While memory loss is a common symptom of dementia, memory loss by itself does not necessarily mean that a person has dementia. Really need to work with our doctors to be able to assess that. And there's a couple of good links to resources there. And I'll also put in a plug right now for the engagement center here that we're at. These ladies, Peggy and Karen, have a pretty phenomenal and comprehensive approach to being able to promote well-being and aging. So really fortunate to have them as a local resource. So if anyone else has any questions regarding specifically that element, they'd be a great resource. The importance of this slide is that we see kind of that same downward trend here, not related to cognitive functioning per se, but related to self-esteem across the lifespan. And there was already some disparity between males and females represented by the blue and red lines. And then they end up about the same once you get to about mid 80s there too. So what we want to look at, or what's important with that and the general cognitive decline through the course of the lifespan, is this, which looks at there is a possibility between levels of performance, this much of a gap, and probably more as we get to understand more about aging. The reason for this gap is that purple line, that higher level performance, comes from optimally exercised skills. And this is both physical and cognitive aging performance. So that's both how we take care of our bodies and how we take care of our minds. So the idea being that this is a pretty substantial increase, and those are the things we can influence. And so if there is simply a graph or a shape that gave us some hope for why should we start putting some effort into doing some of these things now, this would be the reason. And what we're finding all the time is that this continues to increase. Has anyone ever heard of superagers? It's a concept that's worth looking up. It's a growing group of people as they age that are not, well, have severely straightened out that whole cognitive decline curve. And so they have levels of physical and cognitive performance that are well above, again, where that bell curve tends to be. They're outliers, but there's enough of them, and we're seeing more and more all the time to suggest that there's a lot we could learn from that, and there's a lot we could do to replicate some of their advances and some of their performance abilities. Unfortunately, I just kind of learned about that towards the end of putting this stuff together. So I can't speak much more to it other than they represent a great deal of potential, and it's worth checking that out. Again, superagers is the term. So there's basically these are the four sort of topic areas we'll cover that's related to healthy brain functioning as we age. First one, maintaining a healthy diet, and we'll go into each of these, so I'll go through this part pretty quick. Most important being good fats, such as those found in fish, olive oil, avocados, things of that nature. Maintaining good cardiovascular physical activity. Exercise aids in executive functioning, which is, again, all those cognitive processes. Reduces declines in tissue density in frontal, parietal, and temporal cortex. These are all important parts of the brain. It might have global effects on the brain as a whole. Minimizing chronic stressors. So talk pretty specifically about stress in the brain. But basically, the more we can manage stress, the better it is for us. It's no different than if we're again talking about one of those high-end pieces of equipment. The more it's stressed, having to go over hard terrain, the more it's, the joints are being jarred together, the suspension's being tested. Stress is what breaks down equipment. It's no different for us in the brain and body. And then stay intellectually engaged. Use it or lose it really is the kind of rule of thumb there. At best, mental activity seems to protect against age-related declines and progression to Alzheimer's disease. At worst, it increases an individual's baseline so that age-related declines begin to affect everyday functioning later in life. So anything we can do to promote our own intellectual curiosity and engagement helps us at a minimum to at least slow the decline. So first and foremost for diet, at age 60 and older, the general advice is to increase protein. Slightly higher than previous years. And one of the things about that is to make sure that as you eat more protein, you're also creating a draw on your body to process it. So, just eating a bunch of steaks and then sitting on the couch all day is probably not the best way to make that a good fuel efficient system. But eat a steak, eat some of the other proteins that have like the fatty fishes, things like that can help you out. And I do recognize when we were down in the southwest part of the state was doing this, and had a pretty vocal cattle rancher right in the front row that called me out immediately when I mentioned that about fatty fishes. She's like, "I'm a cattle rancher. Are you telling me to eat fish?"
Once in a while, it won't hurt you.
Yeah, and I just said, "Ma'am, you are welcome to eat whatever you want. You like avocados," and she did. So, like, well, make some steak tacos and put lots of avocado in it, I guess. So there's options. But protein, increase protein and increase the use of it, the metabolism of it by staying physically active. Antioxidants such as berries, dark grapes, nuts, dark green veggies, sweet potatoes, tea, whole grains, beans, and fish. Healthy fats, already kind of mentioned. There's a good resource for that. And I'm sure these guys, again, here at the Engagement Center have tons of resources on diet as well. And then portion control and appetite. So there's kind of this teeter-totter that can happen related to appetite. So one of the things that can tend to happen as we age is we lose our sensitivity of our taste buds. So for some people, it's just not pleasurable. It's not enjoyable to eat. So for those people, the emphasis may be more on ensuring that they get the proper nutritional intake. And then for others of us, it's about portion control. Doesn't mean you have to fast, But if you just make healthy choices around how much you have on your plate, how much you want to eat, there's a ton of research related to lab rats about portion control and their longevity compared to rats that just get to eat as much as they want. So it's pretty substantial. And we're not talking drastic reductions in calorie intake either. Physical activity. This one's pretty huge. It's been shown to reduce the risk for many adverse conditions, including cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, depression and anxiety, and insulin resistance, as well as supports improvements in sexual health. Physical activity is also associated through the study published in the American Heart Association Journal, found that regular exercising reduces the risk of developing dementia by 40% and all cognitive impairments by 60%. And I can't remember the exact amount of exercise they were tying that to. I want to say it was walking 6 hours a week. So if you look at it, if you could get an hour walk in a day, and even that's an investment. But for those people that were able to do that much, to get that much of an improvement, 40%, that's pretty huge. So here, I want to talk a little bit about that stress in the brain piece. So just like we're talking about, or as I mentioned a couple of times, higher end equipment and knowing how to perform maintenance on it, it's good to know kind of the basic structure of the brain. And so there's a lot of talk about farm stress, and that's obviously one of the big focuses that I have in terms of behavioral health. And there's growing recognition and even some financial support to be able to address farm stress, because we understand that the occupational challenges that come from making a life and a career in agriculture are very unique. There's so many things that people don't have control over that you're faced with a different kind of level of stress. And it's important to begin to recognize that there may be some additional things we need to do to support people in that area. And I think one of the ways of understanding farm stress is to understand stress in general as it relates to the brain. So if you look at the brain, kind of looks like about the size of our hands. We make balls or turn our fists into a ball, put our palms together. Looks kind of like this. About that size, roughly. And so to understand this, if I were to dissect it and cut it in half. So now we're looking at this piece here. So we'll assume my eyes are forward here. One of the ways, of sort of basic brain 101 way of understanding this is my wrist represents my brain stem. So this takes care of all the things I don't have to think about that are essential for daily functioning. This controls my heart rate, my breathing, my blood pressure, my body temperature, all the things that basically keep me supported, keep me alive. Move to my palm here, the fancy name for this. And so here we're talking about brainstem. And then as we start to move up into this structure here, which would be the palm, the fancy name for this is diencephalon. That's way too fancy. We're not going to use that after that reference there. It's the part that we share with reptiles. So we'll just call it the lizard brain. And so if you think about the basic functioning of a lizard, it tends to operate, it doesn't have like high processing skills. That reptile part of our brain tends to function in very black and white basic functions. So either I'm hungry or I'm not. My environment is safe or it's not. I'm hot, I'm cold. And for a cold-blooded reptile, if it feels like it needs to regulate, it's going to go out into the sunlight, start being able to warm up. And while it's out there, if it hears noises it doesn't want to hear, or they're scary to it, or it perceives as a threat, it's going to bolt or get out of there. And that part also controls our movements. It allows that lizard brain to understand there's something in my environment that I'm perceiving as a threat, so I will move my body and get out. That's about as sophisticated as it gets, but it's enough to provide and attend to most basic functions. Then as we move up into this area, which we're going to represent here is my thumb. We'll call that the limbic system. That's the part that's responsible for emotions. That's the part that's associated with attachment, the basis of relationships. And again, anything that you want to incorporate with different emotional functioning. The last part here, which especially in this is going to be these first two fingers, this area here, But basically all this stuff that looks like those wrinkles on my hand, that's the cortex. That's what makes us uniquely human, especially this part, that prefrontal cortex, or these first two fingers. This is the part that allows me to weigh out the pros and cons of my decisions. It's what allows me to think about future plans. It's what allows me to be able to line up my choices with my values, with a higher sense and purpose of meaning. It's what basically allows us to have meaning. It's what connects us to a sense of spirituality or religion or art or whatever else we want to look at. It's everything from concrete concepts to abstract concepts around beauty, aesthetics, art, whatever. Anything that we want to put in terms of concepts, that's that part of the brain. That's the last to develop. So in males, because we're a little bit slower on the uptake, it happens at 26. For females, about 24. It's general assumption right now. And so the reason why this is important is there's a neuroscientist named Dr. Bruce Perry, and he describes us as a species as slow, naked, and weak. We don't have big fangs, we don't have sharp claws, we can't really run all that fast. So what we have to help us survive and be as evolutionary, from an evolutionary term or concept, as successful as we have been, is two main things. One is the fight or flight response. So fight or flight response, if we look at from this, keeping this in mind, one thing to understand is that the vast majority of our growth and evolution as a species on this planet has taken place in small hunter-gatherer societies. That's kind of how we're wired. And again, as I pointed out at the beginning of this, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change based on its environment. So the vast majority of the time we've spent growing and developing and passing on genetic successes generation after generation has been spent in these small hunter-gatherer societies. So let's say we're all part of the same village, and a good chunk of us go out on a hunt out in the forest to try to round up a wild boar for a nice barbecue tonight. And while we're out there in the forest, I get bit in the ankle by a blue snake, represented by a blue snake here. It's cut off a little bit, but that's okay. The eyes are actually kind of scary. But I get bit by this blue snake out in the forest, and it's poisonous, and I'm immediately racked by pain. I can't walk. It's just miserable and agony, and I rely on the kindness of my tribe here to carry me back to the village. Local medicine woman's going to get me patched up, and maybe in about 2 weeks, I'm kind of back to normal and ready to resume a hunting party again. But this has been a hard 2 weeks. Like it's really hurt, and I've not slept well, and it was just agony. So finally, I feel kind of back up to it. We go out on that hunting party again, and I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm just trying to be okay. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see a blue flower. What happens in my brain? Yeah, yep. And so what happens in that split second is this. At this lower part here within the brainstem, my eyes are going to receive this input, this blue cue. And the first thing that goes out the window for the sake of evolutionary and efficiency is that prefrontal cortex. So at that moment, when that cue tells me that there's something life-threatening nearby, the first thing that goes out the window is that ability to think about the future. And understand that neocortex is also responsible for good problem solving, enhanced connections with others, everything that has to do with those more complex thought process. It makes sense it should go out the window. At that moment when I got bit by that blue snake, I don't need to be thinking about how good my wife looks in her grass skirt when we're all going to be dancing around the bonfire later, or how successful the next hunt's going to be. None of that matters, because in that moment I'm tied back to there is a perceived threat, and so that part of the brain doesn't need to be there. My limbic system is that emotional center is going to fire off with fear. But most importantly, what happens down in this section is this piece, that whole lizard part of me is equipping me to either run or fight. That's why we call it fight or flight, obviously. So my brainstem is increasing my heart rate. My breathing is going to get shallow. There's actually changes that go on in my ears and my eyes. And sucrose is being pumped to my large muscle group so I can be prepared to fight or run from this threat. So by contrast, the freeze response is a little bit different. So from an evolutionary perspective, freeze would be like if I go around the corner and there's a grizzly bear, and like my brain just perceives you can't run or fight this thing, then the next best thing it can offer me in that moment is freeze, which can happen to all of us in a lot of different situations. But from this evolutionary perspective, what happens with that is kind of the opposite of fight or flight. So instead of all that blood and energy being pumped to my large muscle groups, it all contracts to my core. The idea being that if that grizzly bear knocks me down, starts chewing on my leg, I will bleed out slightly slower. So I don't know how much tougher that truly is, but you know, the body does what the body can do. The other thing, instead of being pumped with adrenaline and those endorphin and those chemicals to give me more energy, it's pumped with body's natural painkillers to help me endure whatever's going on. So for our purposes, though, we'll stick with the fight or flight thing. Again, this works really well when the threat is a blue snake or saber-toothed tiger or all the things we may be facing. We're living in forests and jungles and whatnot. This does not work very well. Oh, let me back up for just a second. It also was designed not just for these old sort of primitive threats, but to be what we'll call acute. So, okay, I just got bit by this snake. I had 2 weeks to recover. Hopefully I can, with the help of my tribe and everyone else, learn to avoid blue snakes in the future. I'll get a little bit more comfortable every time I get out in the forest, and eventually I'll be kind of back to this baseline and normal. But if I was bit by a blue snake every time I went out hunting, one, I would stop hunting for sure. And then two, it does some really negative stuff to the brain. So the reason I point that out is because, again, this works well in these primitive situations. It does not work well if our threats are no longer a blue snake, but another human being. So for children that grew up in traumatic environments, if the people that were supposed to keep them safe and care for them were the ones that were hurting them, then all of a sudden it's not the blue snake, it's human beings in general that promote that same fight or flight response. It also doesn't work well if that threat, that thing that sparks this process, is because we get behind on loan payments. So every walk to the mailbox, then all of a sudden, a miniature version of fight or flight. People may clench their fist, their heart rate increases, their ability to problem solve starts to diminish. It could be any number of things. And as I mentioned, especially for agriculture as an occupation, where there's so many things beyond your control, and so many of these things are tied directly to a sense of survival, that a lifetime of having that fight or flight process kick in. And again, you know, just like with the bell curve, everything happens in terms of a degree. So, you know, every little stressor doesn't promote the whole sort of full-blown fight or flight. But what it does is if we can't manage those stressors and there's enough of them that keep getting thrown at us, it keeps the brain in the state of dysregulation. It keeps the brain not working well. So all these structures should be in a sequence and harmony with each other. And what happens when we're constantly being bombarded by these stressors that we perceive as significant enough to be a threat to our existence, it keeps the brain dysregulated, so the parts aren't working very well. It keeps us flooded with this really nasty chemical called cortisol. And as we'll come to find out, it has a ton of impact on aging and how well the brain performs. So the idea being, just like any other high dollar piece of equipment, the better we can maintain it and prevent or protect it from severe stressors, the better it's going to maintain and the better it's going to do. So any questions on that? Just kind of basic overview. Okay, because we'll come back to certain pieces of it. So one of the things we can do to promote healthy aging and brain development is to keep the brain intellectually engaged. And so spending time in stimulating environments, there's a ton of research again on laboratory rats on how long they live in like a basic rat enclosure versus other enclosures that have like, I don't know, maybe spinny wheels and like visually stimulating other rats you can hang out with and talk with. So obviously the more invigorating your environment is, the better it's going to maintain that constant interaction and engagement with the brain. So the reason why this is it's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's substantial enough that although our culture tends to see aging in place as sort of like the pinnacle or what we should aspire to, the reality is that if aging in place means, like for example, when my grandmother passed away, and she went before my grandfather, and they were both farmers. If grandpa wanted to stay on the farm, but what that meant really was a sentence to solitary confinement and wouldn't be in his interest. If him staying alone on the farm meant that he was no longer connected to people socially, he was no longer doing things that he enjoyed, then that's not necessarily in his best interest. So as a family and as individuals, we really need to look at what's going to set us up for the most success as we age and what's the best environment to support that. But really, those environments that provide challenges, that provide social connections, and that provide a sense of meaning. So it could very well be that staying on the farm is the most important thing, but we've got to look at that individually for each person. Reading is one of the things that definitely keeps the brain engaged, and kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about so far today, Building a Better Brain at Any Age by Sanjay Gupta is a good one to recommend. Engage in stimulating hobbies or interests that require you to learn new skills, music, art, and language. Maintain faith in religion or spirituality. I'm going to talk about both those also in relation to the brain stuff. So if going through that fight or flight process, if the whole response to a stressor or a threat is for it to basically shut down from the top down. By contrast, some of these activities are able to align everything together. And one of the best ways that I found to be able to mitigate the effects of trauma is what's called multi-sensory pattern repetitive movements. Again, a super fancy term, but what it means is anything that engages as much of the brain and body together is something that's inherently helpful and corrective. And so if you think about it from that brain perspective, what it is aligning all those things. Talk therapy deals with this part. We can rationalize, we can deal with that kind of stuff, but for those people that have had severe trauma where it's rooted in your body now, one of the best ways to engage that, you can't just talk through it, but dance, movement, playing an instrument. In fact, there's very few, I don't know of any other human activity that utilizes as much different portions of the brain as playing an instrument. In terms of engaging, stimulating hobbies, part of the way to looking at this, it's a bit more than just doing crossword puzzles. Really what the way to think about it is not just sort of challenging your brain with puzzles, but challenging your brain to learn new systems, such as learning a new language, learning to play an instrument. And this can really be done at any age. In fact, one of my hobbies is to build guitars out of cigar boxes. You can do it really cheap. And if anyone wants information on that, I'll send you more than you probably ever had any interest in. But for about $15, you can build an instrument with one string. And if you can go like this, because you play with a slide, you don't actually have to fret or get a lot of fine details in your fingers, and hold a pick, and they even make clips or picks that'll clip onto your thumb. So if you could do this, you can learn how to play an instrument. And that process is one of the things that kind of challenge to the brain is one of the things that can definitely help us. What I'll talk about with spirituality, actually, before I go to that, if you think about it, anyone here have any hobby or something that you do that allows you to feel like you're in the zone? Like you're no longer concerned about what I've got to do tomorrow or what I should have done yesterday, but you're doing something that you're just so invigorated with that just keeps you so focused, where you kind of lose sense of track of time. Anyone have any hobbies or anything like that they have in their lives?
I do a lot of jigsaw puzzles.
And is it something that's engaging enough to where, okay, good. That zone is kind of what we're talking about. And that in and of itself is inherently healthy. I think there's a really kind of tentative nod back in the back of the room. Would you like to share what yours is?
Sure, hiking.
Okay, yeah. And I would bet that if you pay attention to it, maybe you're very intentional about it, there's probably a repetition and pattern to your steps and to your breathing where those things line up. And you're taking in all this around the environment. So that's like that pattern, repetitive, multi-sensory experience. And jigsaw puzzles can become the same thing because you're constantly looking at visually, how do things piece together? So all these activities, fly fishing is a great one. It's one of the things we used to teach the kids in corrections, and just learning how to do those movements. I'm not very good at fly fishing. but I have a ton of respect for just the movements of it and the benefit of that. So anything that gets us into that zone that's inherently healthy, that restores, repairs trauma. And I really think that true connection in terms of religion or spirituality is about aligning all those parts of the brain together too. That's what I think allows us to feel connected and receiving of that higher sense of purpose and meaning. So all those things are hugely important. Also then sleep quality, sleep is one of those things that also follows that sort of downward decline from the slides we talked about relatively early on. So as we age, it does impact our sleep, the quality of sleep, the length of sleep, all those things that go with it. So anything we can do to improve our quality of sleep is definitely in our interest. In fact, there was some brand new research that came out as I was doing this about being able to see how much the brain's ability to clear out this protein associated with Alzheimer's disease is tied to our circadian cycle. So if we're not getting good quality of sleep, it can impact the brain's ability to clean out that protein. There's some sleep tips for older adults. You can also talk to your doctor or research sleep hygiene. And then lastly is maintain social connections. Social connections is probably going to be our most important protective factors. And when I mentioned that as a species, we're described as slow, naked, and weak, what we're equipped with is one, fight or flight. But the other thing that probably has the most impact on our evolutionary success and our biggest survival mechanism is our tribe. And so to be ostracized from your tribe was almost a sure death penalty in our early experiences as a species on this planet. And it's why we're so biologically driven to connect with other people in a lot of ways. But it's that tribe that allows us to take care of getting through hard times. It's what allows us to have a sense of connection and purpose. One of the first conversations I had with Candy, she mentioned a quote by Margaret Mead. Do you remember that, Candy?
No. I'm the one with the dementia. I don't. I don't remember that, but it was stupid.
It was fantastic. So Margaret Mead was an anthropologist that studied a lot of primitive cultures. And she talked about that, or I think she was asked, what was the first indication of, was it humanity or our evolution of human beings? And she said that it was finding skeletal remains of someone that had a broken femur that had healed. Because what that meant was that for that tribe, in its drive to survive, they were still able to prioritize caring for someone. Because if you slowed down your tribe's ability to escape from attacks or to pursue the wild game, whatever was needed to survive, if you slowed it down, you were necessarily kind of left behind. You became a liability. It still works this way with pack animals. So the first human culture that decided we were going to prioritize caring and helping someone recover, that was like the emergence of humanity in her mind. So, and I think it's a great example. A different way of looking at this is that there's a study that has followed 724 men since they were teenagers in 1938. This is the Harvard Happiness Study. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail with it, but it's kind of a really cool thing to check out. And there's TED Talks on it, there's YouTube videos, because it's been going for a long time. And it's substantial enough that of these 724 men, researchers would contact them back annually and even talk to family members, getting a sense of quality of life data, and ultimately this happiness scale. And the biggest takeaway from it, the clearest message that we get from the 75-year study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. So there's a lot of things that go into health and well-being, but maintaining our quality of relationships is probably the most important aspect of all of those. And so with everything we've talked about, from diet to maintaining good physical health to managing stress, the better we do that, the more we can maintain our social connections too, which are probably the most important aspect of this. The lack of social connection is one of the biggest risks in suicide. So shift gears here for just a second. We do have to be aware that older adults have the highest suicide rate in the country. I won't go specifically into a lot of those, but we also need to look at, especially for our rural communities, that suicide attempts tend to be more lethal. And there's a lot more access to lethal means involved in those too. So what this speaks to is the need to take every concern seriously. And some of the basic warning signs, these pair relatively with symptoms of depression, sadness that has lasted longer than 2 weeks, consistent worries about issues such as money, family, and health, consistent trouble sleeping or concentrating, frequent trouble remembering things or feeling confused in familiar places, changes in activity, engagement, or personality, persistent sad, anxious, or empty mood, loss of interest or pleasure in hobbies and activities, feelings of hopelessness, pessimism, feelings of guilt, worthlessness, and helplessness. Those, like I said, tend to be associated with symptoms of depression. And one of the things that gets really tricky, and I think why you need to be able to preface warning signs, is that once, this doesn't happen in all cases, but it's common enough it bears mentioning, that sometimes once people have really been struggling with this massive burden, feeling disconnected from others, feeling hopeless about the ability to do anything about it, if they become resolute on a plan to complete suicide, then all of a sudden there's a lifting of all that. So someone that could have been sad and depressed now all of a sudden the fog is lifted. It may not necessarily be that they're out of the woods. In fact, it could speak to quite the opposite. So it can be a little bit beguiling or confusing. The main thing to be aware of is knowing people well enough that if there's any sort of change in pattern, if there's a change in mood, there's a change in how they normally are, we just want to keep an eye out for that. This theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, has a number of, what they've looked at is for lethal or near lethal suicide attempts, very serious ones requiring medical intervention, that some of the common factors involved in those were these two are the most substantial: thwarted belongingness or a sense of being alone, and then a perceived burdensomeness. I'm a burden to others. So think about the difficulties that are inherent in aging. And one of the things I want to talk about in relation to trauma too is that one of the ways of understanding trauma is all trauma involves loss. So even the situation I was talking about with the snake, what part of the trauma there is, yes, it's getting bit and the agony of the poison and all that other stuff. But the big loss is my sense of connection when I was out on that hunt. The ability to engage in activity that used to be socially gratifying, gave me maybe a sense of purpose as a hunter-gatherer society. That loss, where now all of a sudden this is a threat, that's huge. And so if you look at in terms of also investment in land and agriculture and being like, the fourth generation now on this land and the worries and stress about, am I the generation that's going to lose it? That's huge. And so all these things around burden, all these things around loss, and with aging, the number of relationships that pass on, the friends and family members. My dad, I think, is 82 now. And so I know the first thing he does every day is read the obituary to see who else he knows he's got to go to the funeral for. My mom's like, she does like potato salads and stuff like that for every church in town for a funeral. So the cumulative losses in that, I think, is really huge. And I think people are just beginning to understand that connection to trauma and aging from the losses of relationships. But what this can come down to is that for those of us, as we age, if we take on the mindset that, okay, now I'm developing health problems, I've lost most of my friends, I feel like I'm a burden to my kids. If those thoughts grow, that tends to be, those things together tend to be what increase the risk for that. So the reason why this is important is if we can help people, one, what's the opposite of being a burden? What's that?
A helper.
Helper, contributing to others, right? Being able to give something. If we can help people have that perspective and allow them to feel a sense of connection, we reduce two of the biggest risk factors associated with serious suicide attempts. So one of the things, one of the systems that's in place to do that is called COMET, stands for Changing Our Mental and Emotional Trajectory. There's a number of organizations across the state that will offer this training. It's a 2-hour training to equip people to be able to have conversations if you are concerned about someone that you care about. So there's a number of options like this. One is mental health first aid. That's a pretty long one. The training for that is pretty substantial. It's great, but it's a big investment in time. The other is question, persuade, refer, or QPR. COMET, though, in particular, was based on evidence from rural people and developed in rural communities. It includes a very intentional set of questions and guidelines meant to provide that sense of connection to other people. And the idea being is that, again, if we talk about that brain structure, most of us exist somewhere between wellness and this vulnerable space. Over here behind this says crisis. So the idea is to not spend all of our life in crisis. That's bad, obviously. But most of us operate somewhere here. And so if someone you care about, we know basically what they look like in terms of their mood, their presentation, their level of engagement. If we see someone moving from being vulnerable towards crisis, by knowing how to interact here, we can help change their trajectory and get them back towards wellness. That's the entire point of it. It's to be the other person, help move them back towards wellness. It's based on just a handful of questions, being able to make some behavioral observation about you don't seem to be yourself lately. How are you? Not just the pass off fine that we normally say if we just meet someone in passing, but really, like, how are you doing? I know that seems like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders recently. Concerned about you. I care and like to know how you're doing. I've noticed you haven't been at coffee or kids' sports games or high school games, whatever it may be. How are things at home, work, school with your friends? And can we get some coffee sometime soon? And sometimes it's more severe than that. It's like, let's make a call together. Let's get a hold of the pastor. Let's get a hold of, there's a number of resources that are available at the end of this. And it's just important to know in your community what's available. It could be extension agents. It could be Centennial Health. It could be a number of things. But the big point with this is just being able to care enough to reach out to others. And this is hugely important. One, because in my career, I've done, I don't know how many suicide assessments. I lost track long ago. A lot of them, probably for about the last 10 years at least, have largely been influenced by elements of that interpersonal theory of suicide. And one of the questions that's asked in assessing someone's risk is, have you ever made a plan to complete suicide and something stopped you? And the number of times that someone, regardless of their age, was able to cite some small gesture of care by someone else as the thing that stopped them, and going back to that last slide, change that trajectory, even when the other person didn't realize what they were doing. Something as small as a text, something as small as a wave or checking in or making some joke, or again, taking away that belief that I'm a burden, that I'm disconnected, that I'm alone. So that has always given me tremendous hope that one of the biggest things we can do to support each other is just be caring human beings, to expand our sense of what it means to be a tribe. Because really now in our situation we've got today, we can be tribes our tribe can extend across the entire globe. And that's huge. It's an opportunity that previous cultures simply didn't have. And so the opportunities for connections, now granted, there's a difference between quality and quantity of connection. And so social media can tend to promote a lot of quantity of interaction, whereas you miss the quality part. But for each of us on a day-to-day level, understand the quality piece of it and our ability to connect and to be that protective factors for other people is huge.
Do you train people with this program?
Yes. Yep. And it's free. And we could do it online or in person. It takes about 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yep. And this could be something as simple as like Jim and Candy and I are on quite a number of meetings together. It could be, so maybe we're not even in person all that much, but they kind of know my style of interaction now, how much I may or may not speak in a meeting. And so it could be something as simple as at the end of one of those, being able to say, hey, can you stay on with me after the meeting and talk to you for just a second? I've noticed that you haven't been talking to any of these meetings lately. Just want to check in. How are you doing? And it could be something that small that does it. And this isn't rocket science, although it is, the rocket scientists did kind of develop that whole trajectory and gravitational assisting. But the basis of it is human connection. And like I mentioned, I worked in juvenile corrections for a long time and trying to train our security staff to understand how best to support kids that, clinically speaking, were hell on wheels, and understand that they are just trying to they're just trying to survive their world. They're trying to make sense of it. They've had bad experiences with human beings. They expect to be hurt. And so they're testing that out. If their life experience has been other adults are going to hurt me, then when I come in and introduce myself to the new kid in there, he's like, I don't care what your name is, I know what you're going to do. So the one thing he's got control over is to control the timing. So he will push my buttons and push my buttons, call me everything but a God-fearing American citizen, expecting that I'm going to play into this blueprint about losing my cool, taking, being hurtful to him, and recreate that same prophecy or that same blueprint for him. And what we can do by being consistent, like there's still a line in the sand, like you can't physically hurt people, but we're here to support you. And day after day, going back and providing that consistency, we help change that blueprint for people. And trying to equip security guards to understand that, it was really important to have them look at, it is really just the connection you make. It is your ability to establish relationships that is the biggest indicator of a positive outcome for these youth, and your own quality of job satisfaction too. And as hard as that can be sometimes, it's that connection that allows them, whether we're talking about the most fancy therapeutic technique in the world, all the research points out that it's the quality of the relationship you have with the therapist that indicates whether or not there's going to be success. And I think this is not in any way reduced or relegated just to therapy. It has to do with all of our successes. Whether we are mechanics or welders or whatever it is, the ability to have that relational piece is hugely important to success. And that ability to connect, that it doesn't require a great deal of skill. And so the nice thing I like about Comet is it's just basic questions. And one of the things that we got asked a lot in these trainings with security guards is, what if I say the wrong thing? Well, if you come from a place of care, you can't say the wrong thing. Like, there's not a specific formula to it. You can't put thoughts of depression into someone's head. You can't say something that's going to all of a sudden create like a new mental disorder. And so if you're coming from a place of care, being able to preface anything that feels uncomfortable or a little unnatural or a little bit sketchy to you from the standpoint of, I care about you and I just wanted to ask this. That in and of itself is enough of a bridge. And the reason why that is so important is if I go back to, even if Candy were to reach out to me saying, I'm concerned because this is what I've noticed on these meetings, and I shut her down, not just blow her off, but like shut her down and like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't know how anything's different. Like I just come off as really, cold and put up a wall right away. Hopefully, and I know Candy's strong enough to deal with that 100 times over in any given day. But what it does to me at the end of the day, when I'm laying in bed at night and going through my grocery list of, debts and credits or whatever it is, and I get to this point about being alone, even if I blew Candy off in that moment, what it factors into is she cared enough to ask. There's still someone checking with me. So what I've found through the course of doing all this work in residential settings and correctional settings is that point of connection. That's the biggest protective factor. And for those kids that were like severe, grew up in super high risk, some of the most incredibly challenging and horrific environments I could think of, those that were most emotionally unstable and had serious repeated attempts at suicide, it was never any sort of specific fancy therapeutic technique. It was a lot of people rallying together and making connections with those kids. And sometimes having to plan out, how are we going to do this hour by hour if we need to help get them through? And so I want to stress that because we provide that same thing for all of us in our own tribes, in our own families. And so going back to those 5 remembrances at the beginning, we're the nature to be separated from all those that we care about. And so to embrace the time we do have and to make the most of those connections now, not only, does it provide that safety net for others, it engages everything we need in terms of being able to promote healthy brain functioning and our own well-being. And so if you get nothing else from this hour, or this is slightly over an hour now, get nothing else from this, understand the importance of your ability to connect and the importance of those connections with other people. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. At its basis, an expression of care can be enough to be able to change the difference between someone's going into crisis or being able to come back down and get their feet back on the ground. So if you are interested in getting the PowerPoint for this that has the actual active links to all these resources, I'll put my business cards. It says gum, get gum too, but I'll put business cards on the back there so that you guys can grab it. If you want to email me, I'll be glad to send you the email of the PowerPoint so you've got those active links. Any questions?
So if someone called you, does that open up I want to call it a case, or do they become a member of Agribility then, or do you refer out, or?
It's a great question. It depends somewhat on where they're at. Sometimes it could be existing Agribility clients that also want to get some help related to behavioral health resources. Ultimately, what I see my task is helping people get connected with resources in their area. And so one of the things we've recently started doing, because my grant actually covers the entire western part of the country. So we've partnered up with Farm Aid. So when people call into the Farm Aid hotline, they're offered to have me follow up and get them connected with support if they want that.
Okay.
So started to work with people now in Washington and New Mexico. And then again, have some people here in Colorado, and just trying to figure out what's important to me is not just getting connected with a therapist, but getting connected with a therapist that understands the unique strengths and struggles related to agriculture. And we're trying to grow a network specifically with that. Colorado is really fortunate because we have a voucher program that allows people to get 6 free sessions trained from therapists that are trained in agricultural competence and dedicated to working with farmers and ranchers. So everything from providing training to just answering questions. I had someone, we were in Wisconsin 2 weeks ago for a national Agribility conference, did some presentations there and hand out business cards. So I got a call from Indiana on Friday, which isn't part of our Western region, but nonetheless, the guy called just saying, hey, I've been seeing this therapist for a few years, and I just had some questions, like how honest should I be with them? Yeah, pretty honest. That would help. So
You're paying for it.
right, but he just wanted, I guess, a safe place to figure out, like, how do I best, didn't know where else to get some of these questions answered. And so I think of, the great work that Jim and Candy do in terms of going out, seeing someone's environment, figuring out how best to get them linked up to what they need to do to be successful. And I see my task is the same, just in a different sort of resource area. So thank you. It's a great question.
I interject in there to your question, Sharon. So what the Agribility project has been committed to is that connection. So when we're at people's kitchen's table, we might ask them about their behavioral health and their well-being. We do pre-surveys, try to get some information like that. And we talk about Chad being a resource to them, as well as local providers. But since Chad's come on in this last year, he's taken such a load off Jim and I in trying to make those connections across all the communities in Colorado, and Chad's is even broader. So I think it's such a fantastic question that you ask. And again, today for people individually or for service providers, we want them to understand that there's a lot of different fingers on the Agribility glove, so to speak, that Jim and I focus a great deal on physical limitations, but we also have our behavioral health component, and whatever clients are comfortable enough to share with us, we'll try to help network and get them connected. The services of the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, farm service agencies, whatever it is, extension agents is a big deal for us. So that's what we want, if we can get that information from a person at that kitchen table.
Yeah.
I thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
then I'll jump back in again. So, we had a few extra people come in and they're real special to me. So, it's the three